should I feel discouraged? Why should the shadows come? Why should my heart be lonely, away from heaven and home? For Jesus is my portion, my constant friend is he. For his eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know that he watches me.
Welcome to the National Jazz Museum in Harlem's Jazz for Curious Listeners. My name is Lauren Schoenberg. I'm the senior scholar at the museum, and we are looking in depth into the great artistry of Ethel Waters. And of all the early jazz and blues singers, she's the one who, in a sense, was the biggest star at the time in the 1920s, 30s, going into the 40s, and whose, I wouldn't say her star has dimmed, but not that many people remember her or listen to her music or even watch her films, and that's really, really hard to understand because she remains a very contemporary artist in many, many ways. She was born in 1896. She passed away in 1977. We went into some depth into her earliest years. In fact, we even heard a wonderful excerpt from her autobiography. That's in part one of this series. Here in part two, we're going to look into the 1920s, the early 1920s. We're going to spend the whole episode just in the early 1920s, listening to her recordings as they trace her career. In 1920, no one knew who she was, hardly anyone. In 1930, she was a Broadway star. She had appeared in a Hollywood film. She had had best-selling records, had been on the radio, and was a pioneer in so many different ways. So we're going to, again, focus just on the early part of that decade. We'll get to the mid and later years, probably, definitely, in part three. Ethel Waters told the story of her very challenging upbringing in her wonderful autobiography, His Eye is on the Sparrow. In fact, in part one of this series, we had Evelyn Wright, a wonderful singer, jazz singer and entertainer from Cleveland, Ohio, read from His Eye is on the Sparrow about how Ethel felt as a young child. That autobiography was named after a tune that Ethel Waters' grandmother, who really raised her name was Sally Thompson. She loved to hear Ethel sing His Eye is on the Sparrow. It eventually became a tune very much associated with Ethel's, and of course she sang it in her later years, very late years, with Billy Graham's evangelical troupe. It meant a lot to her. You know, there's also, besides that book, another wonderful book about Ethel Waters. Unlike a lot of jazz artists and jazz-related artists, she really got the biography that she deserved. It's called Heat Wave, The Life and Career of Ethel Waters. It's written by Donald Bogle. Cannot recommend it strongly enough, or too strongly, I should say. And I'll be reading just about a page's worth of stuff from this wonderful book to set up the very first recordings that we're going to listen to in just a moment. To summarize the early years of Ethel Waters, as I mentioned, she was raised by her grandmother in poverty. Eventually, the family rose a little bit up financially, but never really saw any money. Ethel, as a young woman, loved to dress up, and she would haunt secondhand clothes stores, and even if there wasn't money to hand around, she would look kind of startling. She also loved to sing and dance, and did a dance called the shimmy, which was really provocative dance of the era that a lot of young people liked to do. And she would sing in nightclubs and places like that for her friends. It's almost like a, classic showbiz story. One night someone heard her around 1917. She would have been turning 21 that year, offered her a gig. She went to Baltimore. Ethel spent her time between Philadelphia and Chester, Pennsylvania, and went to Baltimore, appeared in the theater, did kind of well, went back home, got back to work. She worked at an automat in various restaurants and all different kinds of gigs, sometimes filling in for her mother in domestic work, and then got another offer to go to New York. And she went to New York in 1920 to appear at the Lincoln Theater, one of the great black theaters in Harlem, and she eventually wound up being put in a sister act. It was called the Hill Sisters. There were two sisters. She became the third Hill sister, and she gradually rose to the top of that trio act, her great talent, and she became known as Sweet Mama Stringbean, believe it or not, if you know the relatively heavy Ethel Waters of later years, as you'll see in some of the photos. She was very slim, sang some pretty raunchy blues, among other things, and could do this shimmy dance, just drove people crazy. Well, she actually was in a car accident, had to return home. She went back to rejoin the Hill Sisters. There was only one Hill sister, and a variety of things happened. 1921, she winds up in a gig that really did not portend much, but turned out being the basis of her great career. There was a place in Harlem called Edmund's Cellar. It was a small club. It was not a fancy club. And she wound up being the star there in this small little kind of unknown place. Well, within the course of a few years, she turned it into one of the must-go places in Harlem. All kinds of folks started to come up to see her. She got renowned. She worked a summer in Atlantic City where Sophie Tucker came to hear her, and Bert Williams came to hear her. These were huge stars, and the word started to spread. Well, as her reputation developed at Edmonds, she was approached to record, and there was a small record company called Cardinal Records. And the short backstory here is that Mamie Smith, an African-American vaudeville singer, not really a blues singer. She sang popular songs of the day, including some blues, which had started being popular after the St. Louis Blues arrived in 1914. She made a record for OK Records. It was called The Crazy Blues, and it sold a tremendous amount of records, was a huge hit, and all of a sudden, record labels wanted to record other African-American women, which up to that point, they had been largely almost entirely not recorded by any record label. Cardinal Records went to Ethel Waters, and in 1921, she recorded her first tracks. And we're going to hear them right now. The New York Glide and At the New Jump Steady Ball. Now, these records, are 99 years old. And on the one hand, boy, are they antiquated. The sound quality is not what you're used to hearing, even for records from the 1920s. They're what they call acoustic records. People sang into a horn, no microphone. That was to come a few years later. But I'll tell you something. If you listen to them and listen to her singing, it is extraordinarily clear, concise, swinging. The phrasing is wonderful. And really, the only way to really appreciate it, we're not going to do it here, would be if you were to listen to all the other vocal records of 1920 and 1921, and then listen to Ethel Waters. This next record will sound like Sarah Vaughan or Diane Reeves. It's so far ahead of its time. Well, let's listen to both tracks that came out on that first Cardinal 78. The New York Glide, At the New Jump Steady Ball, accompanied by Al Burry's Blue and Jazz 7, the first recordings of Ethel Waters.
Everybody's going crazy about the different dances of the day. Everybody in this whole entire world is trying to learn the dancing sway. Each one dance you what you learn if something But if you should once see this dance, I know that you would be amused. Anywhere you hear this tune, it lingers on your mind. And if you love good music, why you're bound to keep in time. And when you hear that band, you'll say that that is simply grand. Just grab your partner down the way, look her right straight in the face. Then way back into the memory, runs up to your baby like a bumblebee. Then way back into that eagle rock. Please, Professor, don't you never stop. Bring your partner, then you slide. Got to do your
As we mentioned before, those records are almost 100 years old. And even so, Ethel Waters had such great diction and such great phrasing and such a swing to the way that she sang. She's in a different era than the band that's accompanying her. We're certainly not going to do it now, but if you were to listen to the contemporary vocal recordings of 1920 and 21 for an hour or a day, and then listen to the two records that we just heard, Ethel Waters would sound like Sarah Vaughan and Diane Reeves, and I don't know who else. She was so far ahead of her time. It's an amazing recording. Well, at this point, I am going to read just a little bit here from the wonderful biography we've already mentioned at Donald Bogle's Heat Wave, the life and career of Ethel Waters, because he really sets out perfectly about what happened right after these records were recorded. And it set the stage really for the rest of Ethel Waters' life. Her career never could have happened without this particular juncture. I was going to paraphrase it, but Bogle does it so well, I think we should just hear the way that he put it. He's talking about the record company for which he recorded those two tracks, Cardinal. But Cardinal was a small outfit without the muscle to promote her or even record her in the best way. Waters left the label. Not long afterward, she was contacted by the Pace Phonograph Company for discussions about recording for its Black Swan label. A black-owned company, it was an outgrowth of the Pace and Handy Music Publishing Company, which had been the brainchild of the black composer W.C. Handy, who's known as the father of the blues and whose St. Louis blues Waters had been singing, and his partner, the young entrepreneur Harry Pace. In advertisements, Black Swan's motto read, quote, "The only genuine colored records. Others are only passing for colored." End of quote. Pace had entered the recording business via a circuitous route. Born in 1884 in Covington, Georgia, the son of a blacksmith who had died while Harry was still a child, he was reared by his mother. Everything about young Harry seemed remarkable. At age 12, he completed elementary school. 7 years later, he graduated as class valedictorian from Atlanta University, where he studied under his mentor, W.E.B. Du Bois. For a time, Pace lived in Memphis, where he and Du Bois ran a printing business. In 1905, the two published a short-lived but important publication, the Moon Illustrated Weekly, the first known African-American journal. Also in Memphis, Pace met Handy, who was impressed. He, quote, was a handsome young man of striking personality and definite musical leanings. Pace had written some first-rate song lyrics and was in demand as a vocal soloist at church programs and Sunday night concerts, end of quote, said Handy. Quote, it was natural, if not inevitable, that he and I should gravitate together. We collaborated on songs, end of quote. Once they formed Pace and Handy Music Publishing Company, Pace moved to New York City, married, and eventually settled in a brownstone, as well into a very middle-class lifestyle, at 257 West 138th Street on Strivers Row, the most celebrated neighborhood uptown, known for its sedate but posh brownstones and its high-minded residents. Working in the music business, Pace soon realized, with rare exceptions like Burt Williams and then Mamie Smith in 1920, the white phonograph companies were still not recording African Americans. Pace was determined to change that. There was too much Negro talent around. Before the boom in black blues singers took off, Pace borrowed $30,000, broke off his partnership with Handy, and organized the Pace Phonograph Company, which produced Black Swan records. He opened up shop in the basement of his home. The label was named in tribute to Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, that 19th century slave-born singer who rose to become a renowned soprano called the Black Swan. On the label itself, there was a drawing of a swan. And he approached Ethel Waters. That's the end of reading from Donald Bogle's book. He approached Ethel Waters to come with him, this great record company, and immediately he was attracted by the kind of tunes that Ethel Waters sang. Yes, she sang some blues, but they were different from the blues of Ethel Waters' idols. She loved Ma Rainey. She loved Bessie Smith. And as much as she loved them, she decided she would, in a sense, imitate them by not imitating them and become her own talent. And it was the recordings for the Black Swan label that really set her for fame. The musical director for Black Swan was a young man who had a degree in chemistry from Georgia, who had come to New York to study at Columbia, but got kind of waylaid by being a great pianist and a band leader and a mover and shaker. His name was Fletcher Henderson. So now we have Ethel Waters and Fletcher Henderson and Harry Pace. It's an amazing combination. Let's listen to the very first recordings that she made for Black Swan Records, Oh Daddy and Down Home Blues. Ethel Waters in 1921.
Just like a flower, I am fading away. The doctor calls to see me most every day, but he don't do me no good. Why? Because I'm longing for you. And if you care for me, you will listen to my plea. Oh, Daddy, look what you're doing. Look what you're doing. Oh, Daddy, you with your fooling, think what you're losing. Oh, the little loving that I give to you is going to make you feel all really blue. When you miss me and long to kiss me, you'll regret the day that you ever kissed me. Oh, Daddy, think when you're all alone. Why you want me just to wait and see that there'll be someone else making love to me. Then, Daddy, Daddy, you won't have no lover at all. troubles too. I felt so worried, I didn't know what to do. But there's no use in grieving, because I'm leaving. I'm broken hearted and 60 down. I've been mistreated, ain't got no time to lose. My train is waiting, and I got the job. Woke up this morning, the day was dawning, and I was feeling all sad and blue. Lord, I had nobody to tell my troubles to. I felt so worried, I didn't know what to do. But there's no use in grieving, because I'm leaving. I'm broken hearted and 60 down. Lord, I've been mistreated, ain't got no time to lose. My train is waiting, I got to drive home too.
Those recordings, those two tunes that came out on one Black Swan 78 RPM record, really set the stage for the rest of Ethel Waters' career, because a big tour came out of it that was going to happen in the fall, where they would encounter Louis Armstrong. It's a great story. We'll get to that in a moment. We're going to jump chronologically with the recording to the mid-1920s, but we're putting it here because it fits chronologically in terms of what she was doing. Even though Ethel was having a great success, mostly at Edmund's Cellar in Harlem, but also appearing in various theaters, and she was famous for having, drag-out fights with Edmund of Edmund's Cellar, Edmund Johnson. She'd go appear in another place for a while. She also loved church music, always did. We talked about how her grandmother, Sally Johnson, loved to hear her sing His Eye is on the Sparrow. And here we have something from early 1921 in Baltimore. It's an advertisement from the Baltimore paper. Star Sacred Concert, Sharp Street Memorial, M.E. Church, and the date, all that. And Miss Ethel Waters. And she is singing along with all these other folks. There's an organ, a piano, a violin, there's an offering, there's a reverend, the whole thing. And we're going to hear her sing it's an anomaly. She recorded nothing like this at the time except this one record date in the middle of dozens of very popular best-selling records that she was making. She wanted to do this. It's called He Brought Joy to My Soul, and I think it'll bring joy to your soul. Another side of Ethel Waters.
I can tell the world about this. My Lord, I'll tell the nation I'm blessed. Tell him what Jesus has done. Tell him that the Comforter has come, and he brought joy, joy, joy to our soul. Jesus, he did just what he said. Yes, he did, my Lord, yes, he did. He healed the sick and he raised the dead. Yes, he did, my Lord, yes, he did. And he brought joy, joy, joy to my soul. I can tell the world about sin. My Lord, I tell the nation I'm blessed. Tell him what Jesus has done. Tell him that the Comforter Yes, it was, my Lord, yes, it was. And it brought joy, joy, joy to my soul. I can tell the world about this. My Lord, I tell the nation I'm blessed. Tell him what Jesus has done. Tell him that the Comforter has come. And he brought joy, joy, joy to my soul. Took my feet out the miry clay. Yes, he did, my Lord, yes, he did. He placed them on the rock of eternal ages. Yes, he did, my Lord, yes, he did. And he brought joy, joy, joy to my soul. Oh, I shall tell the world about this. My Lord, I'll tell the nation I said. Tell them what Jesus has done. Tell them that the Comforter has come. And he brought joy, joy, joy to my soul.
What an incredible moment. Ethel Waters going out of her way to make sure that Columbia Records recorded her doing that and got it out there in the middle of all the other pop material she was doing as her career was building in the mid-20s. But as we saw, this is something she was already doing back in 1920, 1921. Right here, we're looking at a clip, just a little press clip here from New York, talking about a New Year's show, 1920 going into 1921. This might have been right before she actually opened up at Edmund's Cellar, and it's just fun to look at it at the Libya, 149 West 139th Street. William Hegeman and his jazz band, together with these high-class entertainers, Ethel Waters, the comedian of the hour, Ethel Williams, whirlwind dancer, Lucille Hegeman, the human nightingale, and Bertha Fisher, late of Hello 1919, are appearing afternoon and evening. It's a great timepiece there. It's funny, you know, they would sometimes talk about singers as comedians or comedians back in those days. You'll see record labels, Al Jolson, many others, Burt Williams. Burt Williams was a comedian and didn't sing as much as he talked, but these terms were kind of interchangeable. So I thought, just enjoy seeing a little bit of the press. She always garnered a lot of press coverage, and once Ethel Waters got with Black Swan Records, which is where we're at right now, they had a wonderful publicity department. Got a lot of press out. You know, there's a wonderful site, if you can get to it, if you're into such things. It's called ProQuest, and you can access it in New York through the New York Public Library. You have to have a library card, and you can get it online. They have a wonderful database of African American newspapers and other newspapers too, but the African American newspapers goes way back into the 19th century, and all kinds of data and articles and research are available that up until a few years ago were not, at least not digitally. You had to go, you know, look through papers or copies of things. It's an amazing resource. That's where a lot of these press things come from that we're looking at in this presentation. Well, the first two records that Ethel Waters made for Black Swan Records really did well, and they got her back in the studio, and she had two more hits, and we will listen to them right now. One Man Nan and There'll Be Some Changes Made.
Good man Sam slipped off the levee one day, fell into the river, then he faded away. When one man Sam gonna find my good man Sam. I made a vow when I got him that I'd never drop him when he was in a jam. The very thought of Sam thinking that's my cup, it's gonna be my place to pick him up. I'm going down to the levee where the water's heavy, gonna find my good man Sam. One man down, levee bound, feet flip-flopping on the ground, ripped up trees, roots and all, just like a cannonball. He outran her shadow, left it far behind, started running sideways, just to keep from flying. 4 miles roundabout, where old Nanny's down. I'm going down to the levee, where the water's heavy, gonna find my good man Sam. I made a vow when I got him that I'd never drop him when he was in a jam. The very thought of Sam thinking that's my cup, it's gonna be my place to pick him up. I'm going down to the levee where the water's heavy, gonna find my good man They say don't change the old for the new, but I found out that this will never do. When you grow old, you don't last long. You're just here, my honey, then you're gone. I loved a man for many years gone by. I thought his love for me would never die. He made a change and said I would not do. So now I'm going to make some changes too. Why, there's a change in the weather, there's a change in the sea. So from now on there'll be a change in me. My walk will be different, my talk and my name. Nothing about me's going to be the same. I'm gonna change my long tall one for a little short fat. I'm gonna change my number where I'm living at, because nobody wants you when you roll that blade. There's gonna be some changes made today. There'll be some changes made. Why, there's a change in the weather, there's a change in the sea. So from now on, there'll be a change in me. Why, my walk will be different, my talk and my name. Nothing about me gonna be the same. I'm gonna change my way of living, and that ain't no bluff. Why, I'm thinking about changing the way
We mentioned before that Fletcher Henderson was the musical director, the young Fletcher Henderson for Black Swan Records, and he's playing piano on some of these early performances and gathering a band of young musicians who were gathered around him. He started to get gigs in New York and some work at ballrooms, and it was out of this that his famous band evolved. Coleman Hawkins was soon to join. Louis Armstrong, we'll get to that in just a moment. A very interesting story happened here with Ethel Waters and Louis Armstrong, and eventually became, the jazz orchestra of the mid to the late 20s. Into the 30s, of course, he had a great career as an arranger and a huge influence in jazz, but all that was still in the future. Black Swan Records put together this tour, and here we see an advertisement that they're coming your way, the Black Swan Troubadours. Ethel Waters, the Black Swan Jazz Masters, and you can write to this address, which was, I think, at Harry Pace's place in Harlem. And you could write there and you could book them, because I guess the idea was the tour would start in Washington, Philadelphia. Word would get around about how great it was, and it did get great feedback and great reviews, and you could book them as this tour was being put together. It's really, really kind of fascinating. They eventually made their way out to Detroit with some very interesting happenings. In November, they got out to Chicago and had a huge hit in a variety of places. We'll talk about that in a moment here. Here you can see an ad for the Regent Theater with a lovely photo of the young Ethel Waters. Let's see, she would be, she would be 26 years old at this time. 3 days only, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Ethel Waters, the 7 Jazz Masters, 7, etc. It's just wonderful seeing these things. Also an ad for a D.W. Griffith film, On the Right, Dream Street, with Richard Barthelmess. It kind of puts everything into context. Now, someone else was to join this tour for a moment, and you might be absolutely surprised to see who it was. It was none other than the boxer Jack Johnson, who actually joined for a leg of this Black Swan Records Ethel Waters tour in 1921-1922. We see him on the left here, just having demolished one of his opponents in the ring. He demolished so many things, breaking through so many of the racial barriers of his time, for which he certainly paid a price. He certainly lived a long life and became the subject of a great play, The Great White Hope, which became a film, the great Miles Davis album, Jack Johnson, and an extraordinary documentary written by Jeff Ward for Ken Burns called Unforgivable Blackness, Jack Johnson. In the Donald Bogle biography of Ethel Waters called Heat Wave, we've been talking about it quite a bit. It's a wonderful book. There are stories about Jack Johnson and Ethel Waters trying to get together. Really interesting stories, and it just kind of highlights the dramatic and historic sweep of Ethel Waters' life, the people that she intersected with. I mean, Harry Pace alone, Fletcher Henderson alone, Jack Johnson alone, and all the others who were to come into her life as her star rose. One of her big tunes, even before she recorded for Black Swan, was called the Georgia Blues. We'll listen to it now. She actually recorded it at the end of this tour, but we'll listen to it now. And then we'll follow with a very unusual, and you might be really knocked out, film clip that has something to do with this tour.
But it won't be very long before I'll be feeling glad. I just sigh, I could die, 'cause I got the Georgia blues and I just feel need to cry. I don't live in Boston, I was born in Maine. If I don't go to Georgia, I will surely go insane. I've got the Georgia blues, 'cause I got bad news. I'm gonna catch a train, and I ain't gonna stop until I'm home again. I'm not satisfied, just let's take a ride. But I'll be happy with my baby by my side. Hear the whistle blow, now it's time to go, 'cause the train is waiting, got no time to lose. A certain party that I know offered me a ticket to Chicago, but he didn't have it. I don't want it, 'cause I got the Georgia blues. I got the Georgia blues, 'cause I got that news. I'm gonna catch a train, and I ain't gonna stop until I'm home again. I'm not satisfied, just let's take a ride. But I'll be happy with my sweet daddy by my side. Hear that whistle blow, now it's time to go. My train is waiting, got no time to lose. Hardy wanted to marry me way last spring, even bought me a great big diamond ring, but he didn't have it. I don't want it, 'cause I got the Georgia blues.
That's all there is. There isn't any more.
Yes, that was Jack Johnson dancing around in front of his band, after his boxing years were over. He made a ton of money on the vaudeville circuit, touring around with a jazz band. He played the bass, or tried to play it, danced around, did some of his poses of boxing. But I thought that would make a nice moment, and just to kind of put in your mind Ethel Waters and Jack Johnson on the stage at the same time. Before that, again, the Georgia Blues, a tune that she sang to great effect for years, even before she started her Black Swan recordings. Well, she's in Chicago, as we mentioned, in early 1922. You can see here from the review, Ethel Waters Packs the Grand. It's kind of hard to read the print on most of this review. She was having a great time, and she decided that she was going to go down south. Now, this was something that a lot of African-American entertainers, if they could, certainly didn't want to do. In fact, just a few years earlier, Lester Young had actually run away from his family band. They were going to go down south, and he escaped. He ran away, and he did it more than one time. He just did not want to experience that. Ethel Waters felt that since she sang the blues and since her records sold so well down there, that it was something that she felt a responsibility to do. But then this happened. What happened was 4 young musicians in the band that was accompanying her, led by Fletcher Henderson, decided that they did not want to go down south. And that's certainly understandable. This is 1922. You're taking your life in your hands. In the Southwest, of course, the Tulsa massacre had just happened, and there were lynchings were commonplace in the South. Among the 4 musicians was a young reed player. He played the reeds, he played the woodwinds, and his name was never known to the public very much, but his name was certainly known to his fellow musicians. He was a consummate professional, great sight reader, just the kind of person you always wanted around. His name was Garvin Bushell. He had a great career. He went on to play with Chick Webb, many great bands, wound up in Las Vegas for many years playing shows, making a lot of money because he played all the instruments. And where you might have heard him is he actually was hired by John Coltrane to play the bassoon on the Africa Brass Sessions, recorded at the Village Vanguard in 1961. Well, here's an article about that tempest. Not a tempest in a teapot. It actually was quite a serious thing. It wound up as a headline article here: musicians will not follow Starr into Crackerland. Yes, this is from the Chicago Defender, the great African-American newspaper of the time. And it lays out the story, as I pretty much paraphrased it. It adds that Ethel Waters, her records sold down south. She had a lot of fans there. She sang the blues, and she wanted to see her fans, and she wanted her fans to see her. So she got some other musicians. They went on the tour. Thank God nothing bad happened. Or I should say they came back in one piece. And her career, going into 1923, 24, well, you know, she was building up her reputation, but a couple of things happened. One was bad. Black Swan Records went out of business. Radio was really cutting into the record industry in the early 1920s. Most of the major record labels, many of them either went out of business or almost went bankrupt. In fact, it was Bessie Smith, who eventually was hired by Columbia Records, that saved them from going out of business just around this time. A good thing that happened to Ethel Waters was that she found a full-time pianist, and that was Pearl Wright, the divorced wife of a physician who had some kids, and she had to make a living. And she wound up being a member of the trio that really defined Ethel's existence at that time. Ethel Waters, her accompanist Pearl Wright, and Ethel's partner at the time, Ethel Williams, who was a dancer and who Ethel put into all of her shows, and she was a wonderful dancer, and they were very, very close. Now, just around the same time, speaking of dancers, a young man named Earl Dancer came into Ethel's life and kind of wanted to take over her career and manage her and expand her career horizons into Broadway and into venues that were not racially segregated, as so many were back in those days. He wanted her to appear in front of white audiences and mixed audiences if and when that was ever popular, which was a very uncomfortable situation for the most part if you weren't in New York City in those days. And something else happened. She was in a review in Chicago, and it was a big hit, and she was reviewed in the white press, which was a big thing for an African-American artist at that time, to be talked about in the terms that she was glowed about in this particular piece. And the guy who wrote it, his name was Ashton Stevens, and he was one of the most famous and well-respected theater critics of the era. And he loved music. He played the banjo. And something about it made him love music so much. And he wrote about Ethel Waters in 1925, and that was a big deal. And by the way, just talking about her intersections with history, for those of you that know the film Citizen Kane, Joseph Cotton's character, Jedediah Leland, is based on this guy, Ashton Stevens, because Ashton Stevens' father was good friends, excuse me, Ashton Stevens was good friends with Orson Welles' father, and he put him into the film Citizen Kane. So it's just another part of the jigsaw puzzle, the crossword puzzle, however you want to think of it, of Ethel Waters' career and how things work. She eventually, through Earl Dancer, negotiated a contract to appear on a white vaudeville tour, which helped her make a lot more money, and also a recording contract with Columbia Records, which again Bessie Smith had saved and was one of the two major recording labels in the United States at that time. But before that happened, when Black Swan Records went out of business, and before she signed with Columbia Records, she recorded for the Vocalion label. And we're going to conclude part 2 of our Ethel Waters series with 2 titles that she recorded. And these are really, really something else, because not only is she swinging and phrasing and singing so wonderfully and so far ahead of her time in many ways, but the pianist is none other than the composer of these songs, Pleasure Mad and Backbitin' Mama. It's the young Fats Waller and Ethel Waters, August 1st, 1924.
I don't What's that saying? Yet I love them all, and I'm always round. But if they fall, then they're graveyard bound. 'Cause I'm living to conquer, yet I know it's bad. I must have my thrill, can't keep still, just pleasure mad.
Well, it's obvious that Fats Waller and Ethel Waters were swinging back there in the summer of 1924, and it was just a matter of time with the rest of the world to kind of catch up with them. And those kind of styles, of course, the quote-unquote swing era would begin just about 10 years later when white America woke up to what had been happening in the African-American musical world for quite a long time. I mean, there's no more rockin' performances than what we just heard. Well, this is all part of Ethel Waters' legacy, how far ahead of her time she was, and we haven't even gotten into the period yet where she becomes an actress and becomes an actress's actress and introduces some of the most famous songs in American history, including a song about lynching, long before Billie Holiday sang Strange Fruit. Well, that will be coming up in a future episode of our Ethel Waters series here on Jazz for Curious Listeners. Let's see Ethel just about 5 years later. She had conquered Broadway. She had conquered radio. She was actually on television way early. And she appeared in a Hollywood film, yes. In 1929, it was called On with the Show. We saw it at the beginning, this clip. At the beginning of part one, we'll watch it again at the end of part two, just to kind of ground us in what she looked like and where she was headed, where we're leaving her off here. thank you so much for joining us for part 3 of this tribute to Ethel Waters as part of the National Jazz Museum in Harlem's Jazz for Curious Listener programming. So many of our programs are available to watch at your leisure on our YouTube channel. There are also many on Facebook, and our website is www.jmih.org if you'd like to support the museum. On behalf of our staff, our board, our volunteers, everyone in our world, I'm Lorne Schoenberg, Senior Scholar at the museum, wishing you the best. Stay safe, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Why should I feel discouraged? Why should the shadows come? Why should my heart be lonely, away from heaven and home? For Jesus is my portion, my constant friend is He. For His eye is on the sparrow, and I know